Hello there, everybody. This is Alan Feldman from the Laguna Woods Democratic Club. Welcome to Black in Laguna Woods, and thank you for taking your time to watch the program today. The Great Migration, that's the migration of people of color, African Americans, from the rural and agricultural South to the cities in the industrial North. Started in 1910. In 1910, it's estimated that 90% of the African Americans, people of color in this country, lived in the South. By the time the migration was considered to be over in 1970, 50% of African American people, people of color, lived in the North. But some people made a reverse migration. They went in a different direction. They moved from the North to the South, in some instances back to the South. Some instances they'd never been there before. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And to talk about that with us, to discuss this, we have Willie Sargent. The Sarge is a long-term resident of Laguna Woods Village, active member in the African American Heritage Club. In fact, Willie was their first treasurer of the African American Heritage Club. He's still an active member of the community. And his family made that reverse migration. So first thing, Sarge, is thank you for being here. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
So your family is one of those families that made a reverse migration. 6 million people went from the South to the North,
yes.
But the Sargents went from the North to the South.
The Sargents went from the North to the South.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
Well, it was really a culture shock for me to move from the North to the South. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and my father moved from Cleveland when I was 3 months old to Detroit, Michigan. And matter of fact, that's where I spent the first 12 years of my life, in Detroit, Michigan. And I really didn't have any idea that a place existed like Jim Crow South. My father, he never talked about it. And then we moved from Cleveland to Detroit, right into the Jewish Polish community. So it was integrated. I was brought up, my first girlfriend was named Judy Weseninski. And we lived right next door to each other. So I had no idea that a place like Birmingham, Alabama existed. So I was raised in Detroit, loved fishing with my grandfather and my grandmother. And my grandfather, they were inspirational to me. And you'll find out later on, after I wrap it up, of what influenced my life. My grandfather only had an elementary school education, but he ended up a supervisor at U.S. Rubber on the graveyard shift. Grandmother only had a grade school education. She started cleaning toilets at Mount Sinai Hospital, and she retired 20 years later as a supervisor in charge of housekeeping. And so these are the type of people that I had influencing me while I was in Detroit. But we like to do a lot of fishing. There was a place called Joe Louis Arena.
Oh, yes.
And it's now Cobo Hall, but we used to fish almost weekly, maybe twice, sometimes twice a week at Joe Louis Arena. And I remember one time my grandmother, she was going to buy me a brand new rod and reel. And we were on our way to Joe Louis Arena. We fished right off the dock there. And she stopped off at Sears and Roebuck and spent the money to buy me a brand new rod and reel. And we got there, and she was trying to teach me how to cast. And believe it or not, I threw the whole brand new rod and reel right into the Detroit River.
How old were you when that happened?
That was, I think I was about 8.
8, okay.
Yeah.
Good thing you weren't 12. You would have had consequences to that.
But it broke my heart because she took what you call a dragging hook, and she fished for it until she actually retrieved it. But we used to go fishing in Canada. We go over to Windsor, Canada to fish. And it was just a wonderful thing to be with my grandparents there in Michigan. And then Father moved us down to the sub. They call it the sub, which is outside of Detroit. And it's a place called Wayne, Michigan.
Yes.
And so we moved to Wayne, Michigan. But my father had a lot of problems with the weather. And so at 12 years old, he had 4 boys, 4 girls. He moved us from Detroit, Michigan to Birmingham, Alabama in 1960.
Wow. So your family, they moved, I'm assuming that they moved north for economic opportunity.
They did.
And then they moved back down south for economic opportunity. The one thing I want to ask you about that, about moving for you personally, and it's just, I don't know how aware you were of what the racial situation was, but that's not really what I'm asking about. Mm-hmm. You're a 12-year-old boy.
Yeah.
You're just beginning your adolescence.
Right.
You're just establishing an identity, busting through the cocoon of the family. And now...
waiting to go to junior high.
Right now, all of a sudden, it's whoop.
That's it.
You better start all over again.
Start all over.
I assume, am I right, that you weren't really enthusiastic about making this move?
My father tricked us. He told us we were going on vacation.
Oh.
And that one vacation never ended. But no, none of us wanted to move, especially to to Birmingham. But at 12 years old, I was really upset because I wasn't going to go to junior high.
Right.
The grade schools in the South, they go from kindergarten to the 8th grade.
I'm not sure they would.
And I was getting ready to go to Romulus Junior High when we were moved from Detroit. So I was really upset about that, but it was culture shock for me also.
That's what I'm wondering. I mean, what's like? When did you realize you were someplace else?
I realized that I was in a different environment when I had to catch the bus to go to school, and they changed buses at the Greyhound bus station. That's where we changed buses, and I walked into the Greyhound bus station, and there were 2 water fountains. It was colored and white. And I had never had any colored water. And I went to the white water fountain. And I drank from the white water fountain. And at that time, I found out the culture was different. My first experience with Jim Crow was at those 2 water fountains. They came and shut it down, put a sign on it, said contaminated, and they really admonished me for drinking out of the white water fountain, that I was supposed to drink out of the colored water fountain. So that's when I found out that there is an entirely different culture that I've been exposed to at 12 years old. And not only that, we went to all segregated school.
Yeah.
It was segregated elementary school, segregated high school, and I was used to going to school with Judy and all of the people that lived in the neighborhood. As a matter of fact, the school in Michigan in the sub was Beverly Elementary, and it was people like Joe Lewis's nephew. He was one of the guys that was in my class, and when we were downtown, Stevie Wonder used to get his hair cut at the same place that we got our hair cut. We had the same barber. But this time, Stevie Wonder he hadn't made the big name for himself at that time. And my brother called him the blind boy. But down south, it's entirely different for people of color, because they didn't even like the way we spoke. We spoke with a northern accent. My sister, she got expelled from elementary school for not saying yes ma'am, no ma'am. Well, they asked her a question, she said yes and no. That's what she was used to saying. But they demanded that we say yes'm and no's'm, and it was just hard for us to, adjust the way that we even spoke down there. But those guys in the neighborhood, they were relentless. They were fearless. There was a guy named Marvin that he came up and introduced himself to me, and he wanted me to hang out with him and the fellows down in Birmingham. And we lived on a street called 13th Street. And 13th Street, you had your whites lived halfway up the hill, and the blacks lived at the bottom of the hill. But there was an alley behind the houses on 13th Street. And I found out how fearless these guys was in the neighborhood because there's a Presbyterian church on the top of the hill, and the Ku Klux Klan used to meet at this church once a month and come down 13th Street, full dress, burning cross. Every month they did. Now the fellows in the neighborhood would go to that alley behind the houses on 13th Street and strategically stack up rocks. And at first, I didn't know why we were stacking these rocks up until that evening when the Ku Klux had the parade coming down. Marvin and the guys would throw the rocks over the house into the street, hitting the Ku Klux. And I only hung out with them once. And you wonder why people of color down there run so fast, and how they can be athletically run.
Yeah.
Well, I was running down the alley, and you don't want to be the last one, because as soon as the rocks start hitting the Ku Klux, they dispersing from the parade looking where the rocks came from. So I ran all the way down the hill, and our house was on the bottom of the hill, and I ran right through the front door and slid right under my daddy's bed. And I never hung out with Marvin and the fellows again. Because it was very dangerous, because if you got caught, you didn't want to get caught, but if you did get caught, you would probably get hurt pretty bad. Yeah.
When you think of the story you told about what happened when you drank from the wrong water fountain,
yeah,
you can imagine what the consequences might be for
throwing rocks.
It strikes me, and I wonder if you agree with this, that this is obviously the Ku Klux Klan marching through a neighborhood of black people.
Of course,
it's terrorism.
It was terrifying.
It's like the brown shirts marching through Berlin in 1933. It's meant to instill fear in the people that live there.
And they met at the Presbyterian church.
Yeah.
That's what really, really gave me a spiritual headache. How can they have this type of philosophy and call themselves Christians? But I didn't hang out with the neighborhood fellows, anymore. And when I moved down to Birmingham, it was so much of a cultural shock for me that I could not identify with the people of color that I was in the neighborhoods with. I didn't join the civil rights movement because I would reflect back on Judy and my Jewish friends and people in Detroit. So I didn't have the philosophy that the people in the South had. So I knew a place like Detroit existed. And if knowing a place like Detroit exists and then being thrust into straight Jim Crow was definitely culture shock for me. So I didn't identify with the civil rights movement until one of the girls that got killed at 16th Street Baptist Church. Her name was Carol Robinson. She played clarinet in the band. She had just made the band. She was a freshman. I was a junior. And you know how freshmen are with juniors.
Yes.
Yeah. So she marched right in front of me. The drum section was right behind the clarinet section. Well, I like Carol because she had long, pretty hair. And that's the reason Judy was one of my first girlfriend, is because Judy had long hair. But the Ku Klux Klan came and threw a bomb into the 16th Street Baptist Church. And that's where the 4 girls were killed. And one of the girls was Carol Robinson. And at that time is when I joined the Civil Rights Movement.
But your father was a minister, as you were, as you are. I mean, but your father was a minister in Birmingham.
Yeah, he had Friendship Baptist Church, which is it's 3 streets over from where 16th Street. When the bomb went off, you could hear it from my father's church.
Now, was he involved in the civil rights
Yeah,
movement?
my father was involved in the civil rights movement, and he was one of the ones that was prominent in bringing Martin Luther King to Birmingham. There was a ministerial association where all of the ministers were a part of this. And there were some that did not adhere to the nonviolent marching and things of that nature, but the majority of them were involved with Martin Luther King. And matter of fact, Martin Luther King was locked up in the Birmingham jail. That's when we started the prayer vigils.
Yeah.
And I went on my first prayer vigil when Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail. But they were organized prayer vigil and permitted. But the one thing that really got me going in reference to Martin Luther King is the king of Martin Luther King. And that king is the one that got a hold of me and turned me into a minister. But I witnessed something at 16 years old that I couldn't believe, and that is just the word of God was strong enough to get all of those kids in the street. Martin Luther King gave us a wonderful sermon, and then he said, "Gonna let nothing separate us from the love of God. Not Bull Connor, not water hoses, not dogs. Nothing can separate us from the love of God." And I heard the word that he gave, and I saw the effect that it had on these believers and non-believers. And I realized that the word of God is very powerful. And so when you see the dogs in the street, fire hoses, and Bull Connor saying that blacks will never work at City Hall in Birmingham. My father was the first black building instructor in Birmingham. You saw George Wallace walk out of University of Alabama saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. My sister walked out of the same door that George Wallace was standing in and graduated from the University of Alabama. So the Word of God is so powerful that there is no difference between the colors of the skin. It has to do with the heart. And the heart can be changed. And God is the only one that can change the heart. But I was down in Birmingham, now active in the civil rights movement. And to hear Martin Luther King speak. And then after he spoke at 16th Street Baptist Church, they opened the front door. Jesse Jackson was standing at the front door. Now all the kids was marching around, "We shall overcome, we shall overcome," inside the church. But when Jesse Jackson opened the front door, and the processional went out, out the front door, and they ended up in the street. And there was the water hoses, there was the dogs, and there was Bull Connor saying, doing all these threatening, things of that nature. But I found out later that the Word of God is even powerful enough to change hearts and change people, because Governor George C. Wallace, he ended up being a Christian, and the same people that he was persecuting was driving him around in a van from Baptist church to Baptist church.
He actually, as I recall, he apologized.
He certainly
later
did.
in his life, he apologized
He
for what he
certainly
had
did.
done.
And when he apologized, I realized that the Word of God is so powerful that it can even change a bigot into loving the same people that he was persecuting and keeping down. And that's when I decided that I was going to be a minister. So, but I had to go a long way around to get to where I accepted what they call the calling in order to preach.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let me just ask you, I'm just curious, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when you were 11, 12 years old, did you ever for a minute think you would end up following in your father's footsteps in that direction?
Those churches that have what do you call those old sisters?
Yeah.
They always put the finger on the preacher's son. And I had no idea, and I had no desire to become a minister. But when all the things that I saw that leaned toward faith, it was just something that I could not answer the call to. And it was a very, very strong calling. The reason I never wanted to be a minister is because I know how ministers' children are persecuted, and ministers' children are held to a higher example. And so I had a son, and one day I just said to myself, I don't want to expose him to what I was exposed to and then one day I had him at McDonald's, and he was walking across the driveway, driving up, and I guess a 16-year-old girl was in a Mustang, and she stepped on the gas, and my son was right in the path of this roaring Mustang, and then it looks like something just lifted him up. And then the Lord spoke to me in a small voice, said, you can't bargain with something that's mine already. You can't bargain saying that you don't want to be a pastor because you don't want your children exposed. Your children already are mine. And that girl stopped and she said, I don't know what happened. I don't know. I said, I know what happened. So I left that McDonald's and went to find my pastor, and I just turned myself in.
So to speak.
So to speak, yeah.
Oh, it's really interesting. It's one of the things that I've learned in speaking with people is I knew the church was a powerful center of the civil rights movement and so forth, but I didn't realize several things I didn't realize. One was I didn't realize the effect of I can't even remember his name right now. I'm sorry, the young 14-year-old who was murdered in Mississippi.
Yeah.
I hope he forgives me. I just can't remember his name. what a seminal event that was, and also just how important the church really is and people's faith is in that. But I want to ask you, us, we're getting short on time here, so I want to ask you, how'd you end up in California?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I wanted to march in the Rose Bowl parade. And
As part of the band?
Yeah, it's part of the band. Pasadena City College is actually the host of the Rose Bowl parade.
I didn't know that.
So I'm sitting in Birmingham watching the Rose Bowl parade on television. I'm saying, you know what? I want to march in the Rose Bowl. So here's how it worked out. My mother's best friend's daughter lived in Pasadena. So my mother and her best friend were going to drive from Birmingham to Pasadena. And my father wouldn't let my mother go unless I drove with him. So I drove out to Pasadena, and we came down Route 66. And I went down to Pasadena City College and enrolled. And matter of fact, I got in the band. And the one New Year's Day I was supposed to march with the band, I got homesick and went home.
Oh my goodness.
So that's how I got to California. And my grandfather down in Birmingham, my father's father, he worked at a place called Bayless Machine Shop. And but they would not let the people of color touch the machines. All he could do was clean up and wipe them down and oil them. And my granddaddy was working on a turret lathe. And I said to myself, I think I'm smart enough to run a turret lathe. So while I was in California, I got a job with a company called North American Aviation, which is now Boeing. And I became a bee operator on a turret lathe based upon why they wouldn't let my grandfather in Birmingham, Alabama, do nothing more than just clean up and oil the machines. But I made it my business that I was going to at least become a machinist, a bee operator. So that's what I was doing when I got drafted. I was operating a turret lathe in El Segundo. And I got drafted. I had a 2S student deferment, but I was going to Pasadena City in the daytime and working at night.
That's a busy life.
That's a busy life.
That's a busy life. So you went into the Army. We're running out of time here.
Yeah.
So you went into the Army and became Sergeant Sarge. I want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing those stories. It was really interesting. It's, when you come right down to it, when you look at it, you followed your grandfather and your father.
That's it.
You followed them both what they did.
That's it.
You ended up doing it. But your family, they found some success and economic opportunity up north, but they prospered down south too.
Exactly.
Maybe it has something to do with the people in the family rather than the circumstances.
Yeah, my best friend, 6'2", blonde hair, blue eyes, and his last name is Dirksen.
There you go. Well, Sarge, thank you so much. Really, I really do appreciate you sharing your story with us.
It was my pleasure.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. And for everybody watching, I want to thank you very much for watching. And we will see you the next time on Black in Laguna Woods. Thank you again.